The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Clarence's house as King Charles made his way through the familiar corridors. He had returned earlier than expected from his meeting with the Prime Minister, the discussions about the Commonwealth trade agreements having concluded more swiftly than anticipated. His footsteps echoed softly on the polished marble floors as he loosened his tie, looking forward to a quiet evening with Camilla. As he approached the private study where his wife often spent her afternoons, Charles noticed something unusual. The door, typically left open when Camilla was inside, stood slightly ajar. Muffled voices drifted from within, and he paused, recognizing his wife's distinctive laugh followed by a man's deeper tones. The king frowned slightly, not recalling any scheduled appointments for this time of day. Charles moved closer, his curiosity piqued by the secretive nature of the conversation. Through the narrow gap in the doorway, he could see Camilla seated at her mahogany desk, but her usual afternoon correspondence was nowhere to be seen. Instead, spread across the surface were what appeared to be legal documents, their official seals catching the lamplight. Across from her sat a distinguished gentleman in an expensive suit, someone Charles didn't immediately recognize. The stranger leaned forward, his voice low but urgent as he spoke about numbered accounts and discreet transfers. Camilla nodded thoughtfully, her manicured fingers drumming against the desk's surface as she listened intently. The king's trained ear caught fragments of their discussion, words that made his blood run cold. Offshore holdings, undeclared assets, and most shocking of all, funds that seemed to be connected to organizations the Crown had publicly distanced itself from years ago. Charles felt his heart rate quicken as the full implications of what he was witnessing began to dawn on him. His wife, the Queen Consort, appeared to be involved in financial dealings that could potentially destroy everything he had worked to rebuild since becoming king. The modernization efforts, the careful restoration of public trust, the delicate balance he had struck with Parliament, all of it could crumble if these activities came to light. The conversation inside continued, with Camilla asking pointed questions about detection risks and exit strategies. The mysterious visitor assured her that their arrangements were completely secure, that the paper trail had been carefully obscured through a network of shell companies and international jurisdictions. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had orchestrated such schemes many times before, his casual tone suggesting this was merely routine business. As Charles stood frozen in the hallway, memories of past royal scandals flashed through his mind. He thought of his mother's unwavering dedication to duty, her absolute commitment to the integrity of the monarchy. The weight of the crown seemed to press down upon him as he realized that his personal happiness and his royal obligations were about to collide in the most devastating way possible. The king knew that whatever he had stumbled upon in that room would change everything. The woman he loved, the partner who had stood by him through decades of public scrutiny and personal challenges, was apparently living a double life that threatened the very foundation of the institution he had sworn to protect. As the rain continued to patter against the windows, Charles steeled himself for what he knew he had to do next. Charles stepped back from the doorway, his mind racing as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. He needed time to think, to understand the full scope of what Camilla was involved in before confronting her directly. Moving silently down the corridor, he retreated to his private office, where he began to piece together the troubling puzzle that was forming before him. Over the next few days, the king found himself watching his wife with new eyes. Her routine phone calls, which he had always assumed were social or charitable in nature, now seemed suspicious. The frequent trips to London that she claimed were for shopping or meetings with friends took on a different meaning. Even her choice of reading material, financial magazines and international news publications, appeared in a new and unsettling light. Charles discreetly reached out to his most trusted security advisor, Sir Michael Hartwell, a man who had served the royal family for over 2 decades. Without revealing the specifics of his concerns, the king requested a confidential review of all financial activities associated with the royal household. Sir Michael, sensing the gravity of the request, assured His Majesty that the investigation would be handled with the utmost discretion and professionalism. Meanwhile, Camilla seemed oblivious to her husband's growing suspicions. She continued her daily routines with apparent normalcy, attending charity functions, hosting tea parties with dignitaries, and maintaining her public duties as Queen Consort. However, Charles noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She had become more protective of her personal correspondence, often taking calls in private and quickly ending conversations when he entered the room. The breakthrough came when Sir Michael presented his preliminary findings during a private meeting in the king's study. The security advisor's expression was grave as he laid out a series of documents and photographs on the desk. The evidence painted a picture of a sophisticated financial network that stretched across multiple countries, with Camilla at its center. Money was flowing through a complex web of trusts and foundations, some of which bore names that were uncomfortably close to legitimate royal charities. What made the situation even more alarming was the source of these funds. Sir Michael had traced several large deposits back to individuals and organizations with questionable reputations, including arms dealers, corrupt politicians, and even suspected money launderers. The amounts involved were staggering, running into millions of pounds, far exceeding anything that could be explained by legitimate investment activities or inheritance. Charles listened in stunned silence as Sir Michael explained how the operation worked. Camilla had apparently been using her position and access to insider information to facilitate these transactions, providing a veneer of respectability to what appeared to be a money laundering scheme. Her role as queen consort gave her access to high-level government officials, foreign dignitaries, and wealthy businessmen, all of whom could benefit from having their questionable finances associated with the royal family. The king realized that his wife's involvement in these activities put the entire monarchy at risk. If the press or parliament discovered the truth, it would trigger a constitutional crisis unlike anything the royal family had faced in modern times. The public's fragile trust in the institution, painstakingly rebuilt over decades, would be shattered overnight. Charles understood that he was facing the most difficult decision of his life, one that would test his loyalty to both his crown and his heart. The weight of knowledge pressed heavily on Charles's shoulders as he struggled with how to approach Camilla about his discoveries. Every shared meal, every casual conversation, every moment of intimacy felt tainted by the secret that now stood between them. He found himself studying her face for signs of guilt or remorse, but Camilla appeared as composed and confident as ever, discussing their upcoming state visits and charitable commitments with genuine enthusiasm. Sir Michael's investigation had uncovered even more disturbing details. Phone records showed that Camilla had been in regular contact with several individuals who were known to intelligence services as persons of interest. These weren't just wealthy eccentrics or harmless social climbers, but people with documented connections to international crime syndicates and hostile foreign governments. The implications were staggering, suggesting that the royal family might have been unknowingly compromised at the highest levels. Charles decided that he needed to gather more concrete evidence before making any accusations. He instructed Sir Michael to expand the investigation, despite the risks involved. They began monitoring Camilla's communications more closely, tracking her movements and analyzing her financial records with forensic precision. The king was careful to maintain normal appearances, attending public functions and fulfilling his royal duties while secretly building a case against his own wife. The breakthrough came during a state dinner for the visiting president of a prominent European nation. Charles watched from across the room as Camilla engaged in what appeared to be a casual conversation with the president's financial advisor, a man who had been flagged by international authorities for his involvement in several corruption scandals. The exchange lasted only a few minutes, but Charles noticed Camilla discreetly passing what looked like a small envelope to the man during their handshake. Later that evening, as they prepared for bed, Charles finally decided to test the waters. He casually mentioned that he had noticed her speaking with the president's advisor, commenting on how charming the man had seemed. Camilla's response was immediate and telling. She became defensive, claiming that she had barely spoken to the man and couldn't even remember what they had discussed. Her obvious nervousness and the inconsistency of her story confirmed Charles's worst fears. Unable to sleep that night, the king walked the corridors of the palace, grappling with the magnitude of the situation. He thought about his coronation oath, his promise to serve his people and protect the realm. He considered the legacy of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, who had dedicated her entire life to the unwavering service of the crown. The choice before him was becoming increasingly clear, even as it broke his heart. The next morning brought devastating news from Sir Michael. Intelligence services from 3 different countries had independently identified Camilla as a person of interest in their investigations into international money laundering networks. The net was closing in, and it was only a matter of time before other agencies began asking uncomfortable questions about the Queen Consort's activities. Charles realized that he was running out of time. If he didn't act soon, the scandal would explode beyond his control, potentially destroying the monarchy itself. The king understood that protecting the institution might require sacrificing his personal happiness, just as his ancestors had done throughout history. As he stared out at the London skyline from his office window, Charles began to formulate a plan that would preserve the crown while ensuring that justice was served, regardless of the personal cost to himself and those he loved. The confrontation Charles had been dreading finally came on a crisp Thursday morning in late November. He had carefully planned the timing, ensuring that they would be alone in their private quarters with no scheduled interruptions. Camilla was reading the morning papers over breakfast when Charles quietly placed a manila folder on the table beside her teacup. She looked up with a quizzical smile that quickly faded when she saw the serious expression on her husband's face. Charles sat down across from her, his voice steady but heavy with emotion as he spoke. He told her that he knew about the secret meetings, the offshore accounts, and the network of questionable associates she had been working with. As he outlined the evidence that Sir Michael had compiled, Camilla's face went through a series of transformations, from confusion to denial, then to a kind of resigned acceptance that confirmed everything Charles feared. What followed was the most difficult conversation of Charles's life. Camilla initially tried to minimize her involvement, claiming that she had been naive and manipulated by others. She insisted that she had never intended to harm the monarchy or compromise Charles's position as king. However, as he pressed her for details, a different picture emerged. The Queen Consort had been far more involved in the scheme than Charles had imagined, actively recruiting new participants and even suggesting ways to expand their operations. The most shocking revelation came when Camilla admitted that the activities had been going on for years, starting long before Charles became king. She had used her position as the Duchess of Cornwall to build relationships with wealthy individuals who needed their money cleaned through respectable channels. Her royal connections provided the perfect cover for what had grown into a multi-million-pound operation spanning several continents. Charles Imbert listened in stunned silence as his wife explained her motivations. She spoke about feeling financially insecure despite their wealth, about wanting to ensure their future independence from the constraints of royal protocol. She had convinced herself that she was simply being practical, taking advantage of opportunities that her position afforded her. The money, she claimed, was meant to provide them with options and freedom that their royal roles denied them. As the conversation continued, Charles realized that the woman he had married was not who he thought she was. The Camilla he loved was generous and caring, someone who had supported him through the most difficult periods of his life. But sitting across from him now was someone who had systematically betrayed the trust placed in her, someone who had put her personal desires above the welfare of the institution they were both sworn to protect. The king found himself thinking about the countless people who depended on the monarchy for stability and continuity. He considered the Commonwealth nations that looked to the crown as a symbol of integrity and tradition. The weight of responsibility felt crushing as he realized that his personal feelings had to be secondary to his duty as sovereign. Every moment he delayed taking action was another moment that the monarchy remained vulnerable to exposure and scandal. Camilla seemed to sense the direction of his thoughts. She began to plead with him, promising to end all her questionable activities immediately and to cooperate fully with any investigation. She spoke of their love, their shared history, and the life they had built together. Her tears were genuine, and for a moment Charles wavered, remembering the woman who had stood by him when the rest of the world seemed to be against him. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and the risk to the crown too great. As Charles looked into his wife's eyes, he knew that their life together as they had known it was over. The decision he was about to make would echo through history, affecting not just their personal relationship, but the future of the British monarchy itself. Charles spent the following 3 days in intense consultations with his most trusted advisors, constitutional experts, and legal counsel. The gravity of the situation required careful planning to minimize damage to the monarchy, while ensuring that justice was served. Every decision had to be weighed against its potential impact on public confidence in the crown and the stability of the constitutional system. Sir Michael had expanded his investigation to include a complete audit of all royal household finances and communications. The results painted an even more troubling picture than anyone had anticipated. Camilla's network extended far beyond what they had initially discovered, involving prominent figures in business, politics, and even other royal families across Europe. The scope of the operation suggested that she had been building this empire for the better part of a decade. The Attorney General was briefed on the situation in strictest confidence, and preliminary discussions began about how to handle the legal implications. The challenge was enormous, as prosecuting a sitting queen consort would create unprecedented constitutional questions. There were concerns about royal immunity, the separation of powers, and the potential for political interference in what needed to be seen as an independent judicial process. Meanwhile, Camilla continued her public duties, appearing at charity events and state functions as if nothing had changed. To outside observers, she seemed as composed and regal as ever. But Charles could see the strain in her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. She was clearly struggling with the weight of her secret and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The breakthrough that sealed Camilla's fate came from an unexpected source. Intelligence agencies monitoring international financial crimes had intercepted communications between several of Camilla's associates discussing an upcoming operation that would involve laundering money for a known terrorist organization. The conversation made it clear that Camilla was not just aware of this plan, but had actively helped to facilitate it by providing access to certain diplomatic channels. When Sir Michael presented this evidence to Charles, the king felt physically ill. The realization that his wife had potentially aided terrorist financing struck him like a physical blow. This was no longer just about financial impropriety or personal greed. It was about national security and the safety of innocent people. The weight of his crown had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. Charles knew that he could no longer delay action. The evidence against Camilla was overwhelming, and the risks to the realm were too great to ignore any longer. He authorized Sir Michael to begin coordinating with law enforcement agencies and intelligence services to plan her arrest. The operation would need to be executed with precision to maintain security while preserving the dignity of the crown as much as possible. The legal team advised that Camilla would likely face charges, including money laundering, conspiracy, and potentially even treason, given the national security implications of her actions. The penalties could include decades in prison and the forfeiture of all assets connected to her illegal activities. More personally devastating for Charles, they explained that as a convicted felon, she would automatically lose her royal titles and be barred from any future involvement with the monarchy. As Charles prepared for what would likely be the most difficult day of his reign, he reflected on the irony of his situation. He had waited decades to marry the woman he loved, fighting public opinion and family pressure to be with Camilla. Now that same love was forcing him to destroy her in order to protect the institution that had finally allowed them to be together. The personal cost of being king had never been more apparent than it was in those dark hours before dawn. The arrest was scheduled for the following morning, when Camilla would be taken into custody at a private location away from the palace to minimize media attention. Charles would need to address the nation that evening, explaining the situation while trying to maintain confidence in the monarchy. The speech would be the most important of his reign, and possibly the most difficult words he would ever have to speak. The morning of the arrest dawned gray and cold, matching the somber mood that had settled over the palace. Charles had barely slept, spending most of the night walking through the staterooms and gardens trying to find peace with the decision he had made. At precisely 9 o'clock, as Camilla was attending what she believed to be a routine meeting with her private secretary, officers from Scotland Yard's Specialist Financial Crimes Unit moved into position. Charles was not present for the arrest itself, having decided that witnessing his wife being taken into custody would be too painful to bear. Instead, he remained in his study, staring out at the Thames while Sir Michael coordinated the operation via secure communication channels. The arrest went smoothly, with Camilla showing little resistance once she realized that her situation was hopeless. She was escorted from the building with dignity, her head held high despite the circumstances. The immediate aftermath was chaotic, as the royal household staff scrambled to manage the crisis. All of Camilla's personal belongings were seized as evidence, including her jewelry, clothing, and private papers. Her office was sealed off while forensic accountants began the massive task of tracing the full extent of her financial crimes. The scale of the investigation required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and international partners. Charles faced the heartbreaking task of informing his children and closest family members about what had happened. The conversations were among the most difficult of his life, as he had to explain how the woman they had come to accept and respect had betrayed everything the family stood for. William and Harry were stunned by the revelations, struggling to reconcile their memories of Camilla with the evidence of her criminal activities. The palace communications team worked frantically to prepare for the media storm that would inevitably follow once news of the arrest became public. A comprehensive strategy was developed to control the narrative, emphasizing the king's commitment to justice and the rule of law, while minimizing damage to the institution of the monarchy. Every statement would need to be carefully crafted to balance transparency with the need to protect ongoing legal proceedings. As word of Camilla's arrest began to leak to the press, Charles realized that the most challenging part of his ordeal was just beginning. He would need to address the nation that evening, explaining the situation to a shocked and confused public. The speech would require him to be both a grieving husband and a strong leader, showing vulnerability while maintaining the dignity and authority that his position demanded. The legal proceedings moved swiftly as prosecutors presented the evidence against Camilla to a magistrate. The charges were extensive, covering years of financial crimes and including the devastating accusation that she had aided in the financing of terrorist activities. Her lawyers argued for bail, but the flight risk and the serious nature of the charges meant that she would remain in custody pending trial. Charles spent the afternoon reviewing his speech with constitutional experts and communications advisors, ensuring that every word struck the right tone. He needed to acknowledge the personal pain he was experiencing while demonstrating his unwavering commitment to his duties as king. The balance was delicate, as showing too much emotion might undermine confidence in his leadership, while appearing too detached could make him seem callous and unfeeling. As evening approached, Charles prepared for what would undoubtedly be remembered as one of the most significant royal addresses in modern history. The television cameras were set up in the same room where his mother had delivered many of her most important speeches to the nation. Standing in that sacred space, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors, Charles felt the full weight of centuries of royal tradition pressing down upon him as he prepared to speak words that would forever change the monarchy. At 8 o'clock that evening, television screens across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth displayed the familiar sight of King Charles seated at his desk in Buckingham Palace. However, the gravity of his expression and the somber tone of his voice immediately signaled that this would be no ordinary royal address. Speaking directly to the camera, Charles began by acknowledging the rumors that had been circulating throughout the day before confirming the shocking truth that had devastated his personal life and rocked the monarchy to its core. With carefully measured words, the king explained that his wife, Queen Consort Camilla, had been arrested and charged with serious financial crimes that threatened the integrity of the crown and the security of the realm. He spoke of his personal anguish at discovering her betrayal, while emphasizing that no one, regardless of their position or relationship to the throne, was above the law. The speech struck a careful balance between showing his human vulnerability and demonstrating the unwavering strength of the institution he served. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with shock, disbelief, and speculation as people struggled to process the news. Many expressed sympathy for the king, recognizing the impossible position he had been placed in between his personal loyalty and his duty to the nation. Others questioned how such extensive criminal activity could have gone undetected for so long, raising uncomfortable questions about security and oversight within the royal household. In the days that followed, more details of Camilla's crimes emerged through court proceedings and police statements. The scale of her operation was staggering, involving millions of pounds laundered through an international network of shell companies and corrupt officials. Most damaging of all was the confirmation that she had indeed facilitated the financing of terrorist activities, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the intelligence community and prompted a complete review of royal security protocols. Charles threw himself into his royal duties with renewed determination, understanding that the monarchy's survival depended on his ability to demonstrate strong leadership during this crisis. He increased his public appearances, met with political leaders from across the spectrum, and worked tirelessly to reassure the public that the institution remained stable and trustworthy despite the personal scandal that had engulfed it. The trial proceedings dominated headlines for months as prosecutors methodically presented their case against the former queen consort. Camilla's defense team attempted to portray her as a victim of manipulation by more sophisticated criminals, but the evidence of her active participation and leadership role was overwhelming. Phone recordings, financial documents, and testimony from co-conspirators painted a picture of a woman who had systematically exploited her royal position for personal gain. When the verdicts were finally delivered, Camilla was found guilty on all major charges. The judge, acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the case, sentenced her to 25 years in prison and ordered the forfeiture of all assets connected to her criminal enterprise. In a final humiliation, her royal titles were formally stripped, and she was banned from any future contact with members of the royal family. Charles watched the sentencing from his private study, feeling a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and vindication. Justice had been served, and the monarchy had survived its greatest test in generations. The institution's willingness to hold even its most senior members accountable had actually strengthened public confidence in the crown, demonstrating that the ancient principles of justice and the rule of law remained paramount even in the modern era. In the months that followed, Charles began the slow process of rebuilding both his personal life and the public image of the monarchy. He remained unmarried, choosing to focus entirely on his duties as king rather than seeking another companion. The experience had taught him that the crown demanded sacrifices that few could truly understand, and he embraced his role as a solitary guardian of an institution that was larger than any individual, including himself.